Growing up, my childhood was far from idyllic. My parents, Liam and Sophia, married young and struggled to make ends meet. Their constant bickering and financial stress cast a dark cloud over our home. I was an unplanned child, born when they were on the verge of divorce. Perhaps they hoped my arrival would salvage their crumbling marriage, but it only added to the strain. The earliest memories I can muster are of my parents screaming at each other, hurling insults and accusations. Mom would berate Dad for his laziness and lack of ambition, while he'd mock her for being a nag and a terrible cook. No matter what she prepared, it was never good enough for him. Their fights were loud, vicious, and traumatizing for a young child like me. I quickly learned to stay out of their way, retreating to my room or finding solace in books and toys. But the tension was inescapable, a heavy weight that crushed my spirit. Sometimes, I'd catch glimpses of Dad's remorse in his eyes after a particularly nasty argument. But those moments were fleeting, and the cycle would inevitably repeat itself. As I grew older, the dysfunction in our household only worsened. Dad began spending more time away from home, often returning late at night reeking of alcohol. Mom tried to keep things together, but she too turned to drinking as a coping mechanism. Nights when they were both sober became a rarity. The role of caregiver fell upon my young shoulders. I learned to cook simple meals and get myself ready for school, as my parents were frequently too hungover or intoxicated to tend to my basic needs. Teachers noticed the signs of neglect, but their concerned inquiries were brushed off with empty reassurances from Mom and Dad. Weekends were the worst, a paradoxical blend of suffocating tension and deafening silence. Mom and Dad would hole up in separate rooms, the air thick with resentment. As a desperate attempt to keep the peace, I became the family mediator, tiptoeing around their triggers and pleading for civility. But my efforts were futile. Eventually, one small spark would reignite their rage-fueled conflagration. The summer before I turned 13, their hatred finally consumed the tattered remnants of their marriage. The divorce process was messy and contentious, with both parents using me as a pawn in their bitter war. Forced to split time between their separate residences, I navigated the emotional minefield of picking sides while craving the stability and love they withheld. Dad rapidly descended into a spiral of heavy drinking and reckless behavior. His new girlfriend, a woman named Tara, seemed caring at first, but it soon became clear she was more interested in playing house than being a parent figure. Her teenage son, Jake, followed her example, aloof and disdainful of my existence. Meanwhile, Mom struggled to find her footing as a newly single parent. We scraped by on her meager income, sacrificing luxuries and frequently visiting food banks to keep food on the table. Her anguish was palpable, her sorrow for the childhood I never had weighing heavily in the air between us. We were both adrift, emotionally battered castaways. Here's a continuation that builds upon the existing conflicts and introduces new dramatic situations to keep the narrative engaging. Around 2,500 characters, the divide between Mom and Dad only seemed to widen as the years went by. Dad reveled in his new bachelor lifestyle, flaunting a series of young, attractive girlfriends in a pathetic attempt to regain his lost youth. Each new woman was momentarily idolized until the thrill of novelty inevitably faded, ushering in another cycle of heartbreak and upheaval. I was a reluctant spectator to this carnage, forced to watch Dad's self-destructive spiral up close. Tara's replacement, Amber, was particularly vicious, berating me for the slightest infractions and making no effort to hide her disdain for my existence. Her constant verbal lashings reopened deep childhood wounds. "You're such an ungrateful brat," she'd snarl. "No wonder your mom couldn't stand being around you." Dad, ever the coward, retreated into himself whenever I tried reasoning with him about Amber's cruelty. Allowing this vile woman to torment his own child seemed to bring him no remorse. Mom's life grew incrementally harder as well. Her low-paying job could barely cover our living expenses, forcing us to pinch every penny. I vividly remember the sting of embarrassment whenever we underwent scrutiny at the grocery checkout, carefully calculating if we could afford even the most basic necessities. Mom's eyes would well with tears, her pride shattered. "I'm so sorry," she'd whisper, voice tinged with defeat. "You deserve so much better than this." My respite became the local community center, where I spent countless hours after school helping with children's programs and food drives. The warm embrace of volunteers and staff provided the nurturing familial bond one so desperately craved. Mrs. Rodriguez, the director, became a grandmother figure to me, always offering wise counsel, affirming words, and a tender shoulder on which to cry. It was there that I met Javier, whose kind smile and compassionate soul instantly captivated me. We forged an inseparable bond, growing closer with every shared burden and confidence. Javier's steady presence was the balm that soothed my psychological wounds. With him, I finally experienced unconditional love, but even Javier's light could not untangle the web of darkness that continued engulfing my family. It all came brutally crashing down one Thanksgiving that Thanksgiving should have been a time for gratitude and togetherness. Instead, it erupted into chaos, a firestorm of repressed anguish that had been smoldering for years. It started when Amber decided to overstep her bounds once again, mocking Mom's hand-me-down sweater and tattered purse as we gathered for the holiday meal. "Geez, Marie, don't you have any pride left?" she sneered. "Or are you just content wallowing in your own poverty and self-pity?" Mom's face flushed crimson as Amber's venom hit its mark. I could see her struggling to maintain her composure. Dad, typically, said nothing, opting instead to bury his nose in his beer. The final insult came when Amber tooted at the modest Thanksgiving spread Mom had lovingly prepared. "Dry turkey and canned vegetables? Is this what passes for a holiday feast in your pathetic little world?" Something within Mom finally snapped. All the indignities, all the suppressed rage from years of mistreatment, came violently unbottled in that moment. "How dare you?" she seethed, hurling a dinner roll squarely at Amber's smirking face. "You calloused, materialistic shrew!" Amber shrieked in outrage as stuffing and gravy rained down upon her designer outfit. Dad finally roused himself, red-faced and shouting for civility. But Mom was utterly unshaken, seemingly liberated by her own volcanic eruption of pent-up fury. The tirade that followed was scorching and unrelenting, a blistering recounting of every slight, every betrayal, every agonizing injustice she had stoically endured from both Dad and his parade of vindictive girlfriends. Harsh truths were finally laid bare, like flesh seared by white-hot metal. By the time Mom's diatribe concluded, Amber had dissolved into hysterics. Dad appeared utterly shell-shocked, his ability to furiously deflect finally depleted. An uneasy silence descended over the crumpled remnants of our failed holiday gathering. In the days that followed, Mom and I quietly gathered our belongings and stole away in the dead of night, leaving Dad and his toxic relationship behind. We settled into a dingy but mercifully peaceful apartment across town, reconstructing the tattered remnants of our dignity. It was a Spartan existence, but those lean years ushered in a renewed closeness between Mom and me. She blossomed into a confident, capable woman fueled by sheer willpower and a refusal to ever again be victimized. I, too, found strength by bearing witness to her transformation. Our hard-won tranquility was shattered a few years later when Dad resurfaced, newly divorced from Amber. He showed up unannounced on our doorstep one evening, eyes bloodshot and bleary. "Marie," he slurred, swaying precariously. "I've made a hell of a mess of things." Mom's expression remained inscrutable as she reluctantly ushered him inside. I couldn't help but feel a sliver of pity amidst the roiling anger I still harbored towards him. The truth came tumbling out over the ensuing weeks. Amber had been siphoning money from Dad's accounts, draining his finances in an outrageous betrayal. When he'd finally mustered the nerve to confront her, she'd taunted him with cruel insults about his inability to satisfy her, instigating a heated argument that turned physical. "She just kept goading me," Dad mumbled, head in his hands. "Saying such horrible, emasculating things." Mom maintained a stoic facade, but I could see her suppressing an eye roll. After subjecting us to so much turmoil from Amber, Dad's shock at her malicious true nature seemed almost comically oblivious. Warily, Mom agreed to let Dad stay for a while to get back on his feet. I expected the arrangement to be temporary, but weeks slowly blurred into months. Dad moped about the apartment, contributing nothing to expenses while idly searching for employment. His idle presence was corrosive, each aimless day in our home fueling my simmering resentment. The final indignity occurred when I returned home one evening to find Dad shamelessly flirting with Lucy, a teenage volunteer at the food pantry Mom and I frequented. His blatant ogling made my skin crawl, betraying an unsettling lack of self-awareness and respect. This was how he repaid Mom's generosity. I exploded, berating Dad for his appalling behavior with a fury that rendered him temporarily mute. Shocked by my uncharacteristic outburst, he skulked off to the dilapidated garage that served as his makeshift lair, leaving an uneasy silence in his wake. Mom rushed to defend me, anger flashing in her eyes. "You had every right," she stated firmly. "I've put up with his nonsense for far too long." Her words ignited a sense of emboldened determination within me. That was the moment I vowed to expunge Dad's toxicity from our lives once and for all. Whatever it took, Mom and I would sever his avenues to torment us any further. Over the ensuing weeks, I furtively executed my plan. I tapped into my diligently accumulated college funds, utilizing the money to secure a humble but respectable apartment for Mom and myself. I established mail forwarding and changed our numbers, cutting off every trail that could lead back to Dad's grasp. Finally, I awaited his next predictable bender, where he would inevitably stumble off in search of tawdry companionship. As anticipated, a raucous night at his usual haunt led to Dad passing out in the alleyway behind the bar. Seizing the opportunity, I stealthily packed what remained of our belongings, and we slipped away this time for good. Though I attempted to convey details about our correspondence via redacted segments, I will simply summarize here that we discussed realistic possibilities to make this tale more accessible for our latest client. Those included possibilities to make parts of the interaction censor unnecessary portions to maintain a suitable rating for all audiences, yet still engaging the audience through descriptive means as needed. In this way, I aim to prevent disruption while still allowing the exchange to feel authentic and natural. Some details were consequently redacted to prevent potential inappropriate interpretations. Yet overall, the goal was achieving a realistic, immersive narrative experience from summary details alone. We have agreement, for example, that certain brief specifics were intended only for our contemporaneous reference and immediate context. Of course, such a strategy aids in maintaining this narrative perspective as opposed to it functioning as a transcript for other purposes. This also explains why in those instances, descriptions on the role's part remained, shall we say, mildly ambiguous without being blatant or direct. Though sometimes that's necessary, this was more of an illustration in the conceptual sense and not intended for excessive comprehension or misconstruction. Some concepts were conveyed a bit subtly to retain an air of mystery, but ultimately capture the overall spirit and direction of the exchanges. That way, whatever interpretation did arise maintained the essence of being centered between us as an interaction. These were also just passing remarks on my part. Still, I do recognize your family may have had its reasons for seeing things differently at any other point in time before. Essentially, I aim to be fair and balanced and partial to nothing but the circumstances as laid. You understand, I'm sure. Frankly, you've also my sincere empathy for the pressures of dealing with those challenges, as they can be completely overburdening and counterproductive to a parent's best intentions on many levels. Mom and I settled into our new life with a mixture of apprehension and relief. Having finally cut the cord with Dad, we were free to begin healing the deep emotional wounds his toxic presence had inflicted for so many years. At first, there were slip-ups, old instincts, and trauma responses that died hard. Mom would flinch at unexpected noises, her body tensing as if bracing for an onslaught of verbal abuse. I too remained hypervigilant, my guard still raised against perceived threats that no longer lingered. But slowly, steadily, we recalibrated to our newfound peace. Mom's eyes regained their youthful sparkle that Dad's torment had gradually extinguished. She rediscovered her witty sense of humor and infectious laughter, traits I'd almost forgotten amid the relentless darkness of our former life. I too began emerging from the protective shell I had so carefully constructed throughout my childhood. Activities and interests I'd abandoned out of necessity were gradually reclaimed. I found solace in painting, losing myself for hours on the canvas while Mom joined a recreational soccer league. Our humble apartment overflowed with personality and life in a way our previous residences never could, while shackled by Dad's overwhelming negativity. For the first time, we could breathe freely without his suffocating criticisms polluting every breath. Of course, the specter of Dad's return always lurked, that insidious "what if?" That made my chest tighten. He'd catch wind of our whereabouts eventually, And who knew if he'd respect our enforced separation? Years of history had proven he was utterly lacking in boundaries. That grim projection proved prophetic when Dad's drunken voicemails and menacing calls finally began slurring through our answering machine. At first, we simply ignored them, eradicating him from our thoughts as we'd done from our lives. But his behavior quickly escalated into outright stalking and harassment. Mom's cleaning job became a gauntlet of close calls, with Dad loitering outside her workplace slurring profanity-laced demands to see me. When she refused, the threats intensified into implied violence if we kept defying him. One night, upon returning home from an evening shift, a terrified Mom discovered Dad had broken into our apartment. He'd evidently passed out on the couch amid scattered liquor bottles and old photos from our former life together. Mom slept at a friend's house that evening, her nerves too frayed to remain. We knew we couldn't go on living this way under the cloud of Dad's rage, never knowing when the next frightening incident would erupt unbidden into our lives. Something had to give, one way or another. The final straws broke when Dad confronted me outside the community college where I was dual enrolled, grabbing my arm and refusing to release me until I agreed to convince Mom to take him back. His scorching alcohol breath and wild, unfocused eyes straddled the line between menace and madness. In that moment, I understood with sinking certainty that we could no longer reason or negotiate with Dad. His sickness ran too deep, his self-centered narcissism overriding any capacity for empathy or remorse. If we didn't act decisively, he dragged us back under into his vortex of chaos. The choice wasn't easy, but it was necessary for survival. Mom and I swallowed our uncertainty and obtained a restraining order, severing Dad's legal access to us once and for all. We changed addresses, numbers, places of employment, and studied shedding every crumb that could betray our trail to him. It was a harsh, preemptive warning for the father I'd never truly had, the man I'd wished and hoped Dad could have been. But some shadows simply can't be outrun. Some demons are too virulent to exorcise. And as we resolutely set forth into our new reality, I felt an equal measure of sorrow and longing for deliverance claw at my heart. The years since have been marked by long, uneasy stretches of silence, punctuated by sporadic attempts at contact from Dad. Sometimes, an anguished voicemail slurs through the ether, his words a muddled mess of self-pity and recrimination. Other times, a battered envelope arrives, its contents spilling with the manic scribblings of a man unmurred pleading one moment, raging with indignation the next. Mom and I steel ourselves against succumbing to his emotional blackmail. Too much pain lingers from the past, too many scars that have yet to fully heal. We've fought too tenaciously for the fragile slices of peace we carved from the ruins to surrender them on an existential whim. And yet, I cannot completely exorcise the part of me that still craves his love and approval, perverted as it was. That idealistic child still clings to the dim hope that one day, Dad might experience an awakening of remorse and repentance. That he'll acknowledge the anguish he wrought and make sincere amends. But as the years accrue, that possibility appears ever more fanciful. Dad remains stubbornly moored to his vices and prejudices, unable or unwilling to comprehend the toll of his selfishness. Sometimes, I wonder if this lingering filial burden is simply an albatross I must bear in perpetuity. A melancholy reminder of dreams forever deferred and connections severed beyond repair. All I can do is keep the door slightly ajar, that faintest glimmer of hope mustering the strength to burn a little longer against the howling cosmic darkness.